Welcome to Midnight Whispers, the place where ordinary nights crack open and something older slips through. Tonight, we're wandering the forgotten cemeteries of Appalachia. Small clearings choked by trees, stones tilted like teeth. The people who told these stories swear they're true. Lanterns that follow, hands that brush your shoulder, whispers in a dialect no one speaks anymore. If you're new here, subscribe and tap the bell. It's safer when you're not alone. Step carefully. The mist is thick, the names are worn away, and the first grave has been waiting a very long time. Story 1. Bathtub Murder. I never believed in ghosts until I spent 3 nights documenting abandoned cemeteries in the Virginia mountains. What I found there still haunts my dreams, and I swear on my life every word of this is true. The wet footprints appeared every night at exactly 11:47. I know because I checked my watch each time, thinking my mind was playing tricks on me. But there they were, perfect impressions of bare feet, glistening with water that had no source, leading from the cracked asphalt road straight to a weathered headstone marked Margaret Kellaway, 1884 to 1909. I had come to these forgotten mountains to photograph lost burial grounds for a documentary project. Local historians told me about dozens of family plots scattered through the hollows, most overgrown and forgotten since the mining companies moved out decades ago. What they didn't tell me was about Margaret. The first night, I made camp near the Kellaway family cemetery, a small plot surrounded by rusted iron fencing on a hillside overlooking Highway 52. 7 headstones stood in 2 neat rows, their carved names barely visible through decades of mountain weather. Margaret, the stone stood apart from the others, closest to the road. The marble was pristine white, as if someone had cleaned it yesterday. That struck me as odd. Every other marker showed the wear of a century, cracked limestone, tilted angles, names worn smooth by rain and wind. But Margaret's grave looked freshly tended. No weeds grew around the base. No moss stained the surface. Even stranger, the ground around her plot was always slightly damp, despite the dry spell that had lasted 3 weeks. As darkness fell, I set up my camera equipment and settled in to capture the cemetery under moonlight. The mountains pressed close on all sides, their peaks cutting jagged shadows against the star-filled sky. An owl called somewhere in the distance. Everything felt peaceful, almost sacred. Then I heard the dripping, slow, rhythmic drops hitting the pavement below. I followed the sound with my flashlight beam, expecting to find a leaky culvert or maybe condensation from the old guardrail. Instead, I found wet footprints starting at the road's edge, each one perfectly formed and glistening in my light. The prints were small, narrow, a woman's feet. They led up the grassy slope in a straight line toward Margaret's headstone, disappearing about 10 feet from her grave. I knelt beside one print and touched the moisture. It felt ice cold, colder than the mountain air, and smelled faintly of soap and something else I couldn't identify. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe someone had walked through here earlier and I just hadn't noticed. Maybe there was an underground spring creating condensation. But as I examined the prints more closely, my skepticism crumbled. These weren't made by shoes or boots. They were bare feet, and each one was surrounded by what looked like droplets of bathwater. I spent the rest of that first night photographing the prints in the cemetery, documenting everything I could. By sunrise, the mysterious footprints had vanished without a trace, leaving only dry pavement and my increasingly frayed nerves. The next day, I drove into the nearest town, a cluster of weathered buildings called Millfield about 20 miles down the mountain. At the local diner, I asked the waitress about the Kellaway cemetery. Her face went pale when I mentioned Margaret's name. "You been up to that place?" she whispered, glancing around the empty restaurant. "Mister, you need to stay away from there after dark. That woman, to resting peaceful." The waitress, who introduced herself as Betty, had lived in these mountains her whole life. Her grandmother had told her the story of Margaret Kellaway, and her grandmother's grandmother before that. It was the kind of tale that gets passed down through generations, growing darker with each telling. Margaret had been married to Thomas Kellaway in 1903. He was a brutal man, quick to anger and quicker to violence. The other families in the hollow knew what went on in the Kellaway cabin, but domestic troubles were considered private matters back then. Women were expected to endure whatever their husbands dealt out. On a cold February night in 1909, neighbors heard screaming coming from the Kellaway place. By the time anyone worked up the courage to investigate, they found Margaret dead in her bathtub, her skull crushed by repeated blows from a heavy brass candlestick. Thomas claimed she had slipped and fallen, but the evidence told a different story. Blood spattered the bathroom walls. The candlestick lay bent and broken beside the tub. Thomas was arrested, tried, and sentenced to life in prison. He died behind bars 15 years later and was buried in the prison cemetery, unmarked and unmourned. Margaret was laid to rest in the family plot, her grave carefully tended by her surviving relatives until they too passed away or moved on. But according to local legend, Margaret never stayed buried. Every night since 1909, Betty told me, she walks back to her grave. Folks say you can see her footprints, still wet from that bathtub, leading right up to her headstone. She is looking for her family, the ones Thomas took her away from when he killed her. I wanted to dismiss it as mountain superstition, but the memory of those ice-cold footprints made my hands shake as I drank my coffee. Betty noticed my reaction and leaned closer across the counter. You seen her, Haven? To you? She whispered. The prints? I nodded, unable to speak. Then you need to leave, mister. Tonight, Dawn, to go back to that cemetery. Margaret, she done to mean no harm to most folks, but sometimes she gets confused. Sometimes she thinks strangers are Thomas, come back to hurt her again. I should have listened to Betty. This warning. Instead, I drove back up the mountain, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't explain. The documentary project had become secondary. I needed to understand what I was experiencing, needed to document something that challenged everything I believed about life and death. The second night, I positioned myself closer to the road, camera ready and waiting. At 11:47 exactly, the dripping began again. This time I was watching, and I saw the first footprint materialize out of nothing, a wet impression suddenly appearing on the dry asphalt like an invisible foot had stepped in a puddle. Then the second print appeared, and the third. I followed the ghostly trail with my camera, recording each manifestation as it happened. The footprints led up the slope just as before, but this time they didn't. They stopped 10 feet from Margaret's grave. They continued right up to the headstone itself. That's when I saw her. She materialized slowly, like fog condensing into human form. Margaret Kellaway stood beside her own grave, water streaming from her long brown hair, soaking through a white nightgown that clung to her thin frame. Her skin was pale as moonlight, and her eyes, God, her eyes were black holes in her skull, filled with a century of rage and sorrow. She didn't seem to notice me at first. Instead, she knelt beside her headstone and began to weep, her tears mixing with the bathwater that dripped constantly from her hair and clothes. The sound was heartbreaking, a keening wail that spoke of unimaginable loss and betrayal. I should have run. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, but I was frozen in place, camera still rolling as I witnessed something that shouldn't exist. Margaret remained by her grave for nearly an hour, sometimes weeping, sometimes just sitting in silence. As the first hint of dawn touched the eastern peaks, she began to fade, becoming transparent until only the wet footprints remained. By the third night, I was obsessed. The footage I had captured was extraordinary, but I needed more. I needed to understand why Margaret kept returning, what kept her tethered to this lonely cemetery on a forgotten mountain road. This time, I brought flowers, white roses like the ones carved into her headstone. I placed them carefully beside her grave and settled in to wait. When she appeared at 11:47, she noticed the roses immediately. Her hollow eyes fixed on them, then slowly lifted to meet mine. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an instant. My breath came out in visible puffs as Margaret rose from beside her grave and began walking toward me. Water pooled around her bare feet with each step, and I could smell that strange scent again. Soap mixed with something metallic that I finally recognized as blood. She stopped just a few feet away, tilting her head as she studied my face. When she spoke, her voice was like wind through dry leaves, barely audible but somehow crystal clear in the mountain silence. Thomas? The name hung between us like a physical thing. I wanted to tell her no, that I wasn't Thomas, that Thomas was long dead and buried in a prison grave hundreds of miles away. But my throat had closed up completely. I could only shake my head, barely managing that simple gesture. Margaret's expression shifted from hope to confusion to something far more dangerous. The temperature continued to drop, and ice began forming on the camera equipment around me. Her eyes, those terrible black holes, began to glow with a cold, pale light. Thomas, she whispered again, but this time it wasn't a question. It was an accusation. You came back. I finally found my voice, croaking out a desperate denial. I am not Thomas. My name is David. I am just here to document the cemetery. I brought you flowers, but Margaret wasn't listening. She had stepped back into 1909, reliving the night that destroyed her life and trapped her soul in this endless cycle of grief and vengeance. She began to advance again, and I could see water swirling around her feet, not just dripping now, but rising like an invisible bathtub was filling around her. That's when I ran. I crashed through the underbrush, abandoning my equipment as Margaret's wailing followed me down the mountainside. Behind me, the temperature continued to plummet, and I could hear something that sounded like a bathtub overflowing, water cascading over its edges and flooding the cemetery. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, and I didn't stop driving until I was 3 counties away. When I finally worked up the courage to return for my equipment 2 days later, I found everything frozen solid, encased in ice despite the warm spring weather. The camera had captured everything, including my panicked flight and Margaret's anguished screams echoing through the mountains. But the most chilling detail was what I discovered when I reviewed the footage later. In those final moments before I ran, the camera had caught something I missed in my terror. Margaret wasn't alone by her grave. There were other figures standing in the shadows, translucent forms that looked like the other members of the Kellaway family buried in that lonely plot. They had been watching the entire time, waiting for their daughter to come home every night for over a century. Margaret wasn't wandering lost and alone. She was returning to the family that Thomas had torn her away from, the only place where she could find peace in death that had been denied to her in life. I never went back to that cemetery. The documentary was never completed. But sometimes, late at night when the wind is just right, I swear I can still smell soap and bathwater. And I know that somewhere in the Virginia mountains, Margaret Kellaway is still walking home, still searching for the love and safety that was violently stolen from her in a bathtub on a cold February night in 1909. The dead dawn, to always rest easy. Sometimes they just keep coming home. Story 2. Mary Sarver's song The Humming started on my second night in Sarver Hollow, and I swear I can still hear it echoing in my mind 3 months later. I had driven into the remote Virginia mountains to document forgotten family cemeteries for a historical preservation project. What I found in that isolated hollow changed everything I believed about death, childhood, and the power of unfinished songs. The Sarver family plot sits on a hillside overlooking a dried creek bed, surrounded by towering oaks that have stood guard for over a century. 13 small headstones crowd together in the shadow of larger monuments marking the adults. 13 children, all buried between 1897 and 1912. Most of their names have been worn away by mountain weather, but one grave stands apart from the rest. Mary Sarver, 1900 to 1909, age 9. Her headstone was carved from white marble that somehow remained pristine despite decades of harsh winters. While the other markers tilted and cracked, Mary's grave stood perfectly straight, the letters of her name as sharp as the day they were cut. Even stranger, fresh wildflowers always seemed to bloom around her plot, even though it was late October and frost had killed everything else in the hollow. I made camp about 50 yards from the cemetery, close enough to photograph but far enough away to respect the dead. As darkness settled over the mountains, I set up my equipment and prepared to capture the site under moonlight. The silence was absolute. No traffic, no distant neighbors, just the whisper of wind through bare branches. That's when I first heard her humming. It started so softly I thought it was just the wind through the cemetery fence. But as I listened more carefully, I realized it was definitely a human voice. A child's voice, singing a lullaby I had never heard before. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, filled with a sadness that seemed to seep into my bones. The sound appeared to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. When I moved toward Mary's grave, the humming seemed to drift away. When I backed off, it grew clearer. It was as if the entire hollow had become a speaker, resonating with the voice of a little girl who had been silent for over a century. I recorded everything, of course. Hours of that ethereal humming, captured on digital equipment that registered the sound clearly. But when I played it back the next morning, my recordings contained only silence and the occasional rustle of leaves. Whatever I was hearing existed beyond the range of technology. The local gas station attendant in the valley below knew about Mary Sarver. When I mentioned the cemetery, his weathered face grew troubled. "You been up to the hollow?" he asked, studying me with sharp eyes. "Heard her singing, didn't you?" His name was Walter, and his family had lived in these mountains for 5 generations. His great-grandfather had known the Sarvers personally, back when the Hollow was a thriving community of families scratching out a living from the rocky soil. The Sarver children started dying in 1897. First, it was little Thomas, age 3, taken by fever in the brutal winter. Then Sarah, age 5, who drowned in the creek during spring floods. One by one, 13 children were lost to disease, accidents, and the harsh realities of mountain life at the turn of the century. Mary was the last to go. At 9 years old, she was the family's hope, the bright child who could read and write and sang like an angel. She would spend hours on the front porch, making up lullabies and teaching them to her younger cousins. Her voice was said to be so beautiful that birds would stop singing just to listen. In the autumn of 1909, a scarlet fever outbreak swept through the mountains. Mary fell ill on a Tuesday and was dead by Sunday, her fever burning so hot that her parents feared she might spontaneously combust. She spent her final days delirious, singing fragments of songs that no one recognized. Lullabies she claimed she was learning from the other children. She said they were teaching her, Walter told me, his voice dropping to a whisper. The brothers and sisters who had gone before, they were showing her the songs she would need to sing them to sleep. Mary was buried on a cold November morning, the last of 13 children laid to rest in the family plot. Her parents moved away soon after, unable to bear the memories that haunted every corner of their hollow. The community scattered, leaving only empty cabins and a cemetery full of small graves. But Mary never left. According to local legend, her humming started the very night she was buried. Travelers passing through the hollow reported hearing a child's voice singing in the darkness. The melody was always the same, a lullaby that seemed to carry impossible sadness and comfort in equal measure. She is still there, Walter said, singing her brothers and sisters to sleep. Been doing it for over 100 years now. Most folks who hear it say it's the most beautiful and heartbreaking sound they've ever experienced. I should have driven away after hearing Walter's story. Instead, I found myself drawn back to the hollow, compelled by a need to understand what I was experiencing. The second night, I positioned myself closer to Mary's grave, determined to make visual contact if possible. The humming began at exactly the same time, 11:37 p.m. This time I was ready, night vision equipment trained on Mary's headstone. What I saw through the green-tinted display made my blood freeze in my veins. She was there, sitting cross-legged beside her own grave, a small girl in a white dress, her long dark hair hanging loose around her shoulders. She appeared solid enough to touch, but the night vision revealed her true nature. She glowed with a faint, otherworldly light that had nothing to do with reflected infrared. Mary's mouth moved as she hummed, her small hands gesturing as if she were conducting an invisible choir. But it was her eyes that truly terrified me. They were ancient, filled with a wisdom and sorrow no 9-year-old should possess. She was looking directly at the other graves, as if she could see through the earth to the small bodies buried beneath. As I watched, transfixed by the impossible scene, other shapes began to materialize around the cemetery. Translucent figures, all children, all gathered around Mary as she sang. They swayed gently to her lullaby, their ghostly forms flickering like candle flames in a breeze. 13 children, reunited in death, listening to their sisters sing them to eternal sleep. The song continued for over an hour, the melody weaving through variations I had never heard before. Sometimes it sounded like a traditional lullaby, gentle and comforting. Other times it carried notes of profound grief that brought tears to my eyes. Occasionally, it shifted into something that sounded almost like a prayer, as if Mary were pleading with some higher power to let her siblings rest. Near dawn, the ghostly gathering began to fade. The 12 other children disappeared first, winking out like stars at sunrise. Mary remained longer, her humming growing softer until it was barely audible. She turned to look directly at me, and for one terrifying moment, I thought she might approach. Instead, she smiled, a sad, knowing expression that conveyed both gratitude and warning. Then she too vanished, leaving only the marble headstone and the memory of her impossible song. I packed up my equipment and left Sarver Hollow that morning, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Mary had been trying to tell me something important. The lullaby haunted my thoughts, fragments of melody playing in my head at random moments. I found myself humming it without realizing, much to the concern of my family and friends. 3 weeks later, I received a call that changed everything. My nephew Tommy, age 8, had been diagnosed with leukemia. The doctors were cautiously optimistic, but the road ahead would be long and difficult. That night, as I sat beside his hospital bed, watching him struggle with fever and pain, I found myself humming Mary's lullaby. The effect was immediate and profound. Tommy's breathing steadied, his restless movements stilled, and for the first time in days, he fell into peaceful sleep. The melody that had terrified me in that mountain cemetery became a source of comfort in a sterile hospital room. Over the following months, as Tommy fought his battle with cancer, Mary's song became our secret weapon against fear and pain. When the chemotherapy made him sick, I would hum the lullaby and watch him relax. When nightmares plagued his sleep, the melody would chase them away. Other children in the oncology ward began to benefit as well. Nurses started requesting that I visit during the evening hours, bringing Mary's gift of peaceful sleep to kids who desperately needed it. Tommy recovered completely, though the doctors could never fully explain his remarkably smooth treatment process. He had suffered fewer complications than expected, slept better than most patients, and maintained a positive attitude throughout his ordeal. When I told him about Mary Sarver and her cemetery full of children, he listened with the serious attention that only sick children can give. "She was taking care of them," he said simply. "Like you took care of me." I never returned to Sarver Hollow, but I think about Mary every day. I understand now why she never left that cemetery, why she continues to sing night after night in an empty hollow where no living ears can hear her. She made a promise to her brothers and sisters, a vow to sing them to sleep until the end of time itself. Her lullaby wasn't just a ghost story or a supernatural phenomenon. It was pure love, distilled into music and sustained by the unbreakable bond between siblings. Mary Sarver died at 9 years old, but her spirit found a purpose that transcends death itself, to comfort, to soothe, and to prove that some promises are stronger than the grave. Sometimes, late at night when the world is quiet, I still hear her humming. It drifts through my dreams like a gentle reminder that love persists beyond death, that some songs are too important to ever truly end. And I know that somewhere in a forgotten hollow in Virginia, a little girl continues to keep watch over her family, singing them to eternal sleep with a lullaby that bridges the gap between this world and the next. The dead children of Sarver Hollow rest peacefully because Mary Sarver never stopped singing. And because of her gift, living children still find comfort in the darkness, still discover that some songs have the power to heal wounds that medicine cannot touch. That is the true horror and the true beauty of Mary's song. It reminds us that death is not the end, that love finds a way to continue even when everything else has faded away. Story 3. Trail of Tears. Rest stopped. My face was wet when I woke up. Not sweat, tears, streaming down my cheeks like I'd been crying in my sleep. But I done to cry. Haven to cried since my father's funeral 12 years ago. And I done remember dreaming. Done to remember feeling sad. I just woke up in my truck at a rest stop in western North Carolina with my face soaked in the overwhelming sensation that something terrible had happened while I was unconscious. I am a long-haul trucker. Been doing cross-country routes for 16 years. I know every rest stop between Atlanta and Boston. Know which ones have decent coffee, which ones to avoid after dark, which ones are just sad concrete slabs with vending machines. But I never stopped at this one before. Never even noticed it. Mile marker 214 on Highway 19. No signs advertising it. No lights visible from the road. Just a narrow turnoff that appeared in my headlights when I was too exhausted to keep driving. The lot was empty when I pulled in around 2 in the morning. Just my rig in darkness and the sound of wind moving through trees. I'd been driving for 11 hours straight. Needed to log some rest time before the dot pulled me over. Did my usual routine. Set my alarm. Locked the doors. Closed my eyes. And it's the last thing I remember before waking up with tears on my face. I wiped my eyes, checked my watch. 5:30, 3.5 hours of sleep. Not enough, but better than nothing. I started to reach for the ignition when I noticed something on my dashboard. Muddy footprints, small, child-sized, leading from the passenger side door across the dash and disappearing at the windshield. My doors were still locked. Windows closed. No way anyone could have gotten inside. But the prints were there. Fresh. The mud was still damp. I touched one, felt the grit between my fingers. Real, undeniable. Someone or something had been in my truck while I slept. I got out fast, checked the perimeter. The parking lot was still empty. But in the pre-dawn gray, I could see more. This wasn't just a rest stop. Behind the concrete building with the bathrooms was a cemetery. Old, overgrown, headstones tilted at odd angles. Some broken, some so weathered the names had disappeared. And surrounding it was forest. Dense, dark, the kind that looks prehistoric in the early morning mist. A historical marker stood near the cemetery entrance. Metal, official. I walked over to read it. The text made my stomach drop. This site had been a Cherokee burial ground, sacred ground, used for centuries, until 1838 when settlers took the land, built over it, repurposed it. The marker didn't use those words exactly, used softer language, but the meaning was clear. They desecrated native graves and planted their own dead on top. 1838, the year of the Trail of Tears. The forced removal. 16,000 Cherokee marched west at gunpoint. 4,000 died along the way. Exposure, disease, starvation. Their bodies buried in unmarked graves along the route. And this place, this forgotten rest stop, this cemetery built on stolen ground. It sat right along that route. I heard something then. Faint, distant, the sound of crying. Not adult crying. Children, multiple voices. Soft, heartbroken. The sound of kids who cried so long they barely have voice left. It was coming from the cemetery. Every instinct told me to get back in my truck and leave. But I couldn't. Something pulled me forward. Not curiosity, something deeper. Something that felt like obligation. Like I was supposed to be here. Supposed to witness this. I walked into the cemetery. The crying grew louder, but I couldn't locate the source. It seemed to come from everywhere at once. From the ground, from the trees, from the air itself. And underneath the crying, I heard something else. Footsteps. Many footsteps. The sound of people walking. Marching. The shuffle of exhausted feet on hard ground. The temperature dropped. My breath came out in clouds even though it was late September and shouldn't be cold enough for that. The mist thickened, grew denser, and through it, I started to see shapes. Figures. Dozens of them. Moving between the headstones, but not walking on top of the ground. Walking through it, like the earth was at a different level for them. A lower level. The level it had been almost 200 years ago. They were dressed in old clothing. Simple, worn. Some had blankets wrapped around their shoulders. Some carried bundles. Children clung to adults. The children were crying. That's where the sound was coming from. And the adults, their faces. I'll never forget their faces. Exhausted beyond measure. Grief so deep it had become part of their physical structure. The expression of people who lost everything and were being forced to walk away from even the memory of what they had. I stood frozen, watching this procession of ghosts. This echo of a tragedy. And I realized they weren't looking at me. Weren't aware of me. They were locked in their own moment. Their own suffering. Repeating it over and over for almost 2 centuries. Then one of them stopped. A child, maybe 7 or 8 years old. Girl. She was looking directly at me. Not through me, at me. Her eyes were dark, endless, full of sorrow that no child should carry. And she reached out her hand, touched my face. Her fingers were ice cold. And where she touched me, I felt moisture. More tears flowing from my eyes. But not my tears. Hers. I was crying her tears. Feeling her grief. Her loss. Her terror of the unknown path ahead. More of them noticed me then. The adults. They turned, looked at me with those same dark eyes. And they all reached out. All touched me. My face. My arms. My chest. And with each touch, I felt more. More grief. More loss. More accumulated suffering. The weight of an entire people. This tragedy flowing into me. Through me. Drowning me. I tried to scream. Couldn't. Tried to run. My legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed. Frozen. Forced to stand there and absorb centuries of pain. Forced to become a vessel for memories that weren't mine but were now branded into my consciousness. I saw through their eyes. Felt what they felt. The soldiers with guns. The forced march. The cold nights. The hunger. The watching children grow weak and then still. The digging of graves along the roadside. The leaving behind of pieces of your soul with every mile. The knowledge that you never see home again. Never feel safe again. Never stop walking even after your body stopped. Then it ended. Suddenly. The figures faded. The crying stopped. The footsteps went silent. I was alone in the cemetery. Dawn breaking. Birds starting to sing. Normal morning sounds. But I was on my knees. Face soaked with tears. Body shaking. Mind reeling from what I experienced. What I'd been forced to witness and feel. I'd done. You know how long I stayed there. Long enough for the sun to rise fully. Long enough for my rational mind to try and explain it away. Exhaustion, stress, a dream, but my face was still wet. And when I looked at my hands, they were covered in mud. The same mud that had made the footprints in my truck. The same mud these people had walked through, died in, been buried under. I stumbled back to my truck. The footprints on the dashboard were still there. But now there were more small prints, dozens of them, covering the dash, the seats, the windows, like an entire group of children had climbed through my truck, touched everything, left their mark. I tried to clean them, used paper towels, water. They wouldn't. They'd come off. The mud was dry now, permanent, stained into the plastic and glass. A reminder, a mark, proof that what I experienced was real. I drove away, had a delivery deadline in Baltimore, but I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. Couldn't stop feeling the weight of those tears, those touches, that grief. It sat in my chest like a stone. Heavy, cold, permanent. I did research at truck stops, used my phone, found information about the Trail of Tears, read accounts from survivors, looked at the route. That rest stop sat right on it. And the cemetery. I found records, found proof. It had been built in 1839, 1 year after the removal, built on land that settlers had stolen, built directly on top of Cherokee graves that the government had declared no longer sacred, no longer protected, just empty ground ready to be claimed. I found something else too. Other stories, other truckers, other travelers who stopped at that rest stop, who experienced similar things. Hearing crying, hearing footsteps, waking up with wet faces and no memory of crying, finding muddy footprints, seeing figures in the cemetery. Most of them dismissed it, blamed exhaustion, blamed imagination. But a few like me, they knew, they felt it, the weight of that grief, the touch of those ghosts, the burden of witnessing. I haven't been able to cry since that night. Not my own tears anyway. They tried. When my mother died last year, when my marriage fell apart, when I got the diagnosis that was probably going to kill me in the next few years. Nothing. Dry eyes, empty, like I used up all my tears that night. Or like those tears weren't mine to begin with, like they belonged to someone else. Some child who died almost 200 years ago. Some child who needed someone, anyone, to cry for them. But I still feel them. Every day. That weight, that grief, it's part of me now. Woven into my consciousness. I carry it with me. Carry them with me. Those faces, those voices, that suffering. And I wonder if that is the point. If that is what they needed. Not to be forgotten. Not to fade into history. To have someone remember. To have someone feel what they felt. To have someone cry the tears they can no longer shed. The muddy footprints in my truck never came off. They were still there. Dried. Permanent. Other truckers ask about them. I tell them it was kids playing. They accept that. But I know the truth. I know whose feet made those marks. I know whose tears I cried. And I know I'll carry that knowledge until the day I die. Sometimes at night, when I am parked at other rest stops, other forgotten places along forgotten roads, I hear them. The crying, the footsteps, the march that never ends. And I wonder how many other places like this exist. How many other sites of tragedy? How many other forgotten burials? How many other ghosts walking routes that no longer appear on maps? Walking paths that were supposed to lead home but only led to graves. They changed my route. I avoid Highway 19 now. Avoid that stretch of western North Carolina. To go back there. To face those figures again. To carry more than I am already carrying. But I think about them, every single day, and my face is wet again. Same as it was that morning. Tears not crying. Tears that belong to children who died believing they'd been forgotten. Believing their suffering meant nothing. Believing no one would remember. But I remember. I carry their grief. I cry their tears. And maybe that's all they wanted. All any ghost wants. To be remembered. To have their suffering acknowledged. To know that what happened to them mattered. That they mattered. That someone, somewhere, would stand witness to their pain and refuse to look away. The Trail of Tears didn't end in Oklahoma. It never ended at all. It just kept going, kept walking, kept crying, kept leaving footprints in the trucks of strangers who stopped at forgotten rest stops built on stolen ground. And those footprints, those tears, they were still there. Still waiting, still asking the same question they've been asking for almost 200 years. Will you remember us? I do. God help me. I do. Story 4. Black-eyed children of the ridge. The children appeared in my headlights like a photograph burning in reverse. 5 pale figures in old-fashioned Sunday clothes stood at the edge of Dead Man's Cemetery, their faces turned toward my truck as I rounded the mountain curve. For a split second, I thought they were mannequins someone had placed there as a prank. No living children stood that still, that perfectly arranged in the dying October light. Then they began walking toward my vehicle. I was driving the back roads through eastern Kentucky, taking the scenic route home from a business conference in Louisville. The GPS had died 20 miles back, leaving me to navigate by the faded road signs and my increasingly unreliable memory of these mountain highways. When the sun started setting behind the ridgelines, I should have found a motel and waited for morning. But I was stubborn, and I was almost home. The cemetery sat on a shelf of rock jutting out from the hillside, its weathered headstones barely visible through the rusted chain-link fence. I had passed it dozens of times over the years, usually in daylight when it looked like any other forgotten mountain burial ground. Tonight, something was different. The children moved with purpose, their polished shoes clicking against the asphalt in perfect unison. As they came closer to my truck, I could see their clothes more clearly. Victorian-era dresses on the girls, suspenders and bow ties on the boys. The kind of formal wear you might find in old daguerreotypes, preserved in some mountain family, is attic for over a century. I slowed the truck, expecting them to move aside or wave. Instead, they spread across the road in a line, forcing me to stop. The engine idled roughly in the mountain air as I rolled down my window. That is when I saw their eyes. Solid black. No whites, no pupils, just polished obsidian that reflected my headlights like dark mirrors. The oldest child, a girl who could not have been more than 12, stepped closer to my door. When she opened her mouth, her voice carried the weight of centuries. "We need to get home," she said without moving her lips. The words formed directly in my mind, cold and invasive as winter wind through broken windows. "Please give us a ride home." My hands trembled on the steering wheel. Everything in my body screamed at me to drive away, to floor the accelerator and leave these impossible children in my dust. But another part of my mind, some deeper survival instinct, warned me that running might make things much worse. The other children had spread out around my truck now, their black eyes fixed on me with predatory patience. They stood close enough to touch the metal, but I could not feel their presence. No breath fogged the windows. No warmth radiated from their pale skin. "We just want to go home," the girl repeated, tilting her head at an angle that no living neck should achieve. It wanted to take long. My mouth felt stuffed with cotton. I tried to speak, to ask where they lived, but only managed a dry croak. The girl smiled, revealing teeth that were too sharp and too white, like fresh bone carved into points. "Just up the mountain," she continued, her mental voice growing stronger, more insistent. "Past the old mining camp. You know the way." But I did not know the way. The old mining camp had been abandoned for 60 years, ever since the cave-in that killed 37 men in a single afternoon. Nobody lived up there anymore. Nobody had lived up there since I was a child listening to my grandfather, his stories about the disaster that broke the mountain, his back. The engine began to sputter. I pumped the gas pedal, but the truck continued losing power. The headlights dimmed, then flickered, casting the children in strobing shadows that made their movements look jerky and unnatural. My radio crackled to life, filling with static and half-heard voices speaking in languages I did not recognize. The girl pressed her face against my window, her black eyes reflecting the dashboard lights. Up close, I could see that her skin was not pale but translucent, showing the dark network of veins underneath. Her breath did not fog the glass because she was not breathing at all. "They've been waiting so long," she whispered directly into my thoughts. "So very long to go home." The other children began closing in, their hands pressed against the truck, this exterior. I could feel the metal growing cold under their touch, cold enough that frost began forming on the inside of the windows. The engine died completely, leaving us in the thick mountain silence broken only by the static from my radio. That is when I heard the singing. It drifted down from the cemetery, this lullaby sung in harmony by voices that had not drawn breath for decades. The melody was familiar, something my own grandmother had hummed when I was small, but the words were wrong. They spoke of sleep beneath the mountain, of dreams that lasted forever, of children who played in the dark spaces between the world of the living and the world of the dead. My door handle began to turn. I grabbed it with both hands, holding it closed against whatever force was trying to open it from outside. The children, His faces pressed against all the windows now, their black eyes boring into me like living tunnels. Their mouths moved in unison, mouthing words I could not hear but felt in my bones. Come with us. Come home. Come play in the dark forever. The truck shuddered as if something heavy had climbed onto the roof. Footsteps pattered overhead, small feet in polished shoes walking back and forth above my head. More children, I realized. How many were there? How long had they been waiting on this mountain road for someone like me? The singing from the cemetery grew louder, joined now by adult voices. Men and women who had been buried in that hillside plot decades ago, calling for their children to come back to them. Calling for me to bring the children home where they belonged. But these children did not belong anywhere. I could feel it in the wrongness that radiated from them, in the way reality seemed to bend around their impossible presence. They were something else, wearing the shapes of dead children, something that had crawled up from the spaces between what was real and what should never be. My grandfather, whose stories came flooding back. Tales of the mining disaster, of the children who had been playing in the hills when the mountain collapsed. How their bodies were never found, never properly buried. How their parents had died of grief in the years that followed, buried in the cemetery that overlooked the ruins of the camp. How sometimes, on nights when the mist rolled thick through the valleys, people reported seeing children in old-fashioned clothes walking the mountain roads, asking for rides home to a place that no longer existed. The door handles stopped turning. The faces at the windows began to fade, becoming transparent as morning fog. The footsteps on my roof grew lighter, then disappeared entirely. The radio static cleared, replaced by a country music station playing a song about going home. My engine started on the first try. The headlights blazed back to life, illuminating an empty stretch of mountain highway. The children were gone, vanished as suddenly as they had appeared. Only the cemetery remained, its weathered headstones standing guard over the hillside like broken teeth in the darkness. I drove away as fast as the winding road would allow, not daring to look in my rearview mirror until I reached the valley floor. When I finally did glance back, I saw lights moving among the cemetery headstones. Lanterns or candles, swaying back and forth as if carried by unseen hands. The children had gone home after all, but they had not gone alone. In the weeks that followed, I researched everything I could find about that cemetery and the old mining camp. The records painted a picture of tragedy layered upon tragedy, generations of families torn apart by the mountain, this hunger for human sacrifice. The mining disaster had claimed 37 men, but the records also mentioned 13 children who had gone missing in the days after the collapse. Their bodies were never recovered from the rubble-choked tunnels, never given proper burial in the cemetery where their families waited. For 60 years, they had wandered the mountain roads, looking for someone to take them home. I found newspaper clippings from the decades since, scattered reports of drivers who had encountered groups of strangely dressed children on that same stretch of highway. Most had refused their requests for rides. Their cars had broken down, stranding them on the mountain road until morning. A few had simply vanished, their vehicles found days later abandoned on the roadside with no sign of the drivers. But one article stood out from the rest, a story from 15 years ago about a local man who had given the children a ride up to the old mining camp. His truck was found the next day at the cemetery gates, engine still running, driver, his door standing open. Inside the cab, investigators found children, his handprints pressed into the metal dashboard, small fingers that had pushed through solid steel as if it were soft clay. The driver was never found. But sometimes, according to the article, people driving past the cemetery at dusk report seeing 6 figures standing among the headstones instead of 5. An adult man in modern clothes, forever waiting with the black-eyed children for the next traveler to offer them a ride home. I have not driven that mountain road since. When business takes me through eastern Kentucky, I stick to the interstates, even if it adds hours to my journey. But sometimes, late at night when the mist rolls down from the ridges, I wake up with the taste of static in my mouth and the echo of children's voices in my head. They are still out there, still waiting at the edge of that cemetery for someone kind enough or foolish enough to give them what they want. Still asking for rides to a home that exists only in the spaces between what is and what should never be. And someday, someone will say yes. Story 5. Gravestone that writes back. The notebook was filled with 17 new poems when I found it that cold November morning, each one written in handwriting that belonged to a man who had been dead for 37 years. I've been the groundskeeper at Riverside Cemetery in Asheville, North Carolina for the past 15 years. I've seen my share of strange things among the headstones, Midnight visitors, unexplained sounds, flowers that bloom out of season. But nothing prepared me for what started happening at the grave of Samuel Thornton, the poet who died in 1987 and whose spirit apparently never stopped writing. Thornton wasn't too famous during his lifetime. He taught English at the local community college and published a few collections of poetry that barely sold enough copies to justify the printing costs. But after his death, literary critics discovered his work and declared him a hidden genius. Now his grave draws visitors from across the country, pilgrims who come to pay respects to a talent the world almost overlooked. The fans started leaving gifts about 5 years ago. Flowers, of course, but also more personal tributes, books of poetry, handwritten letters, and always pencils and notebooks. They would place these items carefully on his headstone, as if hoping some of his creative spirit might somehow transfer to their own blank pages. I usually cleared away the offerings every few days, following cemetery policy about unauthorized decorations. But the notebooks were different. Something about throwing away blank pages felt wrong, like I was destroying potential rather than just cleaning up litter. So I started leaving them. That was my first mistake. The morning I found the filled notebook, I almost convinced myself that one of the visitors had returned during the night to write in it. Maybe some aspiring poet had been inspired by Thornton's grave and decided to create their own tribute. The handwriting was shaky, like someone elderly or writing in poor light conditions. But the poetry itself was extraordinary. Each poem explored death with a beauty and insight that took my breath away. They weren't too morbid or depressing, but rather celebratory, finding wonder in the transition from life to whatever comes after. The language was sophisticated yet accessible, with metaphors that lingered in your mind long after reading them. I photographed the pages before removing the notebook, planning to research whether these might be previously unpublished Thornton works. But when I compared the handwriting to samples of the poet's writing in the local library, his archives, I found something impossible. The writing in the notebook matched Thornton's hand perfectly, but it was different from his later work. The letters were more shaky and uncertain, like his writing from his final months when illness had weakened his grip. Yet the poems themselves showed a mastery of craft that exceeded anything he had published during his lifetime. I should have stopped there. Should have removed all the notebooks and pencils, chalked it up to an elaborate hoax by some literary fan with too much time and talent. Instead, I found myself placing a fresh notebook and pencil on Thornton's grave that very evening. The next morning, it too was filled with poetry. This time there were 23 poems, each one more beautiful than the last. They explored themes of memory, love, and the strange peace that comes with accepting mortality. Reading them felt like eavesdropping on conversations between the living and the dead, intimate revelations about the nature of existence itself. But it was the final poem in the notebook that made my hands shake as I read it. For the keeper of the stones who tends our rest, who waters flowers and cuts the grass, know that death is not the end of song, but the beginning of a melody that forever lasts. The poem was addressed to me. Somehow, impossibly, Samuel Thornton was writing directly to the man who maintained his grave. I spent that day researching everything I could find about Thornton, his life and death. He had been a quiet, unremarkable man who lived alone in a small apartment near the college. No wife, no children, few close friends. His colleagues remembered him as dedicated but withdrawn, more comfortable with books than people. In his final years, Thornton had battled cancer with the same quiet determination he brought to everything else. He continued teaching until just weeks before his death, refusing to let illness interfere with his passion for literature. According to his doctor's notes, which were part of the public record, Thornton had remained lucid and creative right up until the end, spending his final days writing in a series of notebooks that were never found after his death. That night, I placed another notebook on his grave. But this time, I also left a pencil and a note of my own, asking if he was really Samuel Thornton and how this communication was possible. The next morning brought the most chilling response yet. The notebook contained only 3 poems, but they answered my questions in ways that made me wish I had never asked. The first poem confirmed that yes, the spirit writing these verses was indeed Samuel Thornton. The second explained that death had not ended his creativity but had expanded it, giving him access to insights about existence that the living could never comprehend. But it was the third poem that truly terrified me. In beautiful, haunting verse, Thornton described what he could see from his grave. He could see me reading his poems each morning, could sense my growing fascination with this impossible communication. He could see other graves throughout the cemetery, other spirits who were becoming aware of this breakthrough between the world of the living and the dead. And he warned me that not all of them were as benevolent as a lonely poet who just wanted to share his final gift with the world. I stopped leaving notebooks after that, but the damage was already done. Other graves throughout Riverside Cemetery began attracting their own mysterious offerings. Visitors started reporting strange experiences, feelings of being watched, whispered voices in languages they didn't recognize, cold spots that seemed to move with purpose through the grounds. The phenomena escalated quickly. Notebooks left on other graves were filled not with beautiful poetry, but with disturbing messages, threats, and descriptions of violence that made my stomach turn. Some were written in what appeared to be blood rather than pencil lead. Others contained symbols that hurt to look at directly, geometric patterns that seemed to writhe and shift when viewed peripherally. I tried to stop it by removing all writing materials from the cemetery, but visitors kept bringing them. Word had spread through online forums and social media about the responsive graves of Riverside Cemetery. Ghost hunters, occultists, and thrill seekers arrived daily, each one hoping to establish contact with whatever spirits dwelt beneath our peaceful grounds. That's when people started disappearing. It began with a college student named Jessica who had come to film a documentary about paranormal activity. She was last seen placing a notebook on the grave of Marcus Hendricks, a man who had been executed for multiple murders in 1924. The security cameras showed her approaching the grave at sunset, but she never appeared on any footage leaving the cemetery. We found her notebook the next morning. It was filled with increasingly frantic writing that started as normal poetry but devolved into desperate pleas for help. The handwriting changed partway through, becoming harsh and angular, forming words that described unspeakable acts of violence. The final entry was written in what forensic analysis later confirmed was Jessica's own blood, though her body was never found. 3 more visitors vanished over the following weeks, each one last seen leaving notebooks on the graves of particularly troubled individuals. The local police launched a massive investigation, but they found no trace of the missing people beyond the disturbing notebooks filled with messages from beyond the grave. I knew I had to end what I had started. On a moonless night in December, I returned to Samuel Thornton's grave with one final notebook. I wrote a lengthy explanation of what was happening, begging him to help me understand how to stop the malevolent spirits that had been awakened by our communication. His response came not in the form of poetry, but in clear, desperate prose written in his familiar shaky hand. My dear friend, I fear our innocent exchange has opened doors that should have remained forever closed. Death is not merely rest. It is a barrier that separates the peaceful dead from those who refuse to accept their fate. Some spirits linger not from love or unfinished art, but from rage and hunger that grows stronger with each passing year. The notebooks have become conduits, allowing the worst of the dead to reach across the veil and touch the living world. Each message strengthens their connection. Each response feeds their power. Soon they will no longer need the notebooks at all. You must burn everything. Every notebook, every pencil, every scrap of paper that has touched these grounds. Salt the earth where the most dangerous graves lie. Convince the authorities to close the cemetery to visitors until the spiritual activity subsides. Most importantly, you must never write to us again. My own spirit grows darker with each exchange, corrupted by proximity to the malevolent dead who share this space. Even I am becoming something I never intended to be. This is my final message to you, my friend. Remember me as I was in life, a simple teacher who loved words and found beauty in the world. Do not remember the thing I am becoming in death. I followed Thornton's instructions exactly. I burned every notebook, every pencil, every scrap of writing material that had been left on cemetery grounds. I convinced the city council to temporarily close Riverside Cemetery, citing safety concerns and ongoing police investigations. But I fear it was too late. Even with the cemetery closed, I continue to find notebooks appearing on graves during my security rounds. They materialize out of thin air, filled with increasingly hostile messages from spirits who no longer need human visitors to supply their writing materials. The dead have learned to create their own conduits to the living world. The missing visitors have never been found, but sometimes I discover notebooks written in their handwriting, describing their experiences in a realm that exists between life and death. They are trapped, caught between worlds by spirits who feed on the terror and despair of the living. Samuel Thornton no longer writes poetry about the beauty of death. His recent notebooks are filled with warnings and apologies, his gentle spirit corrupted by prolonged contact with the malevolent dead who share his eternal rest. He begs me to destroy each message without reading it, but I cannot stop myself from seeking his guidance. Even now, as I write this account, I can feel the pull of that cursed cemetery. The spirits know I was the one who opened the door between their world and ours, and they will not let me simply walk away from what I have done. Tonight, I will return to Thornton, this grave one final time. Not to leave a notebook, but to volunteer myself as tribute for the chaos I have unleashed. Perhaps if the hungry dead have me, they will leave the innocent visitors alone. If you ever visit Riverside Cemetery in Asheville, do not leave writing materials on any grave. Do not attempt to communicate with the spirits who dwell there. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The gravestone that writes back was never meant to be a gift. It was a warning that we were too blind to understand until it was far too late. Before we go deeper, subscribe and hit that bell. These stories get stranger the further we walk. And let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Story 6. Phantom Funeral of Cades Cove. I saw something in the Smoky Mountains that still keeps me awake at night. Something that made me question everything I thought I knew about death, memory, and what lingers in places where tragedy struck. This happened 3 months ago, and I need to tell someone because the silence is eating me alive. I am a cartographer. I map forgotten places for the National Park Service. My job is to document old trails, abandoned structures, things that need to be preserved or at least recorded before nature takes them back completely. It is solitary work, which is exactly why I took it after my divorce. Just me, my equipment, and thousands of acres of wilderness where nobody asks questions about why I look so tired or why my hands shake when I drink my morning coffee. The assignment was simple: map the remnants of old settler paths around Cades Cove in the Great Smoky Mountains. The area is famous for its preserved homesteads and churches, tourist attractions that see thousands of visitors every year. But my job took me to the parts tourists never see, the forgotten corners, the places that don't make it into brochures. I arrived at the park on a Tuesday in late autumn. The leaves had already turned, painting the mountains in shades of rust and gold. The ranger who briefed me was an older guy named Bill. Weathered face, eyes that had seen too many lost hikers and too many black bears getting too comfortable around humans. He spread a topographic map across his desk and traced a route with his finger. The path led away from the main loop road, up into the higher elevations where the old-timers had their settlements before the government bought the land in the 1930s. He mentioned a cemetery that used to exist up there. Past tense. It was washed away in a flood back in 1923. A freak storm, he said. The entire mountainside had turned into a river of mud and debris. Swept away headstones, caskets, everything. They never found most of the remains. Something about the way he said it made my skin prickle. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Not warning, exactly. More like assessment. Like he was trying to figure out if I was the kind of person who could handle certain things. I started my survey the next morning. The weather was perfect. Clear sky, temperature in the mid-50s. That crisp mountain air that makes you feel alive. I hiked for about 2 hours before I reached the area Bill had indicated. The forest here was different. Older, the trees grew twisted and close together, their branches creating a canopy so thick that even at midday, the light came through weak and gray. I found what remained of the old path. Barely visible now, just a slight depression in the earth where generations of feet had worn the ground down. I followed it, marking GPS coordinates, taking photographs, making notes. Professional, methodical, exactly what I was paid to do. That is when I heard the singing. At first, I thought it was wind moving through the trees. But wind doesn't carry melody. Wind doesn't form words. This was singing, human voices raised in harmony. Old-time hymns, the kind my grandmother used to sing in her church back in rural Kentucky. I stopped walking, listened. The singing was coming from ahead of me. Further up the path. Multiple voices, men and women. The acoustics were strange. The sound seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere at once. My rational mind offered explanations. A hiking group, some kind of historical reenactment. People who came up here to sing in the woods because the natural amphitheater made the harmonies sound beautiful. All reasonable explanations, but my gut knew better. I kept walking, slowly now, every sense on high alert. The singing grew louder. I could make out words. Amazing grace shifted into precious memories, and then into songs I didn't recognize. Mournful, heavy with grief. Then I rounded a bend in the path and saw them. There must have been 30 people walking in a procession through the forest. Men in dark suits and suspenders. Women in long dresses and bonnets. Everyone dressed like they stepped out of a photograph from 100 years ago. They moved slowly, solemnly, singing as they walked. And they were carrying a casket. 6 men bore it on their shoulders. A simple wooden box, handmade, with rope handles. But what made my breath catch in my throat was the water. The casket was dripping water. Not a little moisture, real water. It ran down the sides in steady streams, splashing onto the ground, soaking the shoulders and backs of the men who carried it. I stood frozen. My camera hung useless around my neck. My GPS unit beeped softly, marking my location. The procession moved past me, close enough that I could see the tears on the women's faces, close enough that I could smell the damp earth and something else. Something like standing water, like a swamp, like a grave that had been flooded. None of them looked at me. None of them seemed to see me at all. They just kept walking, kept singing, kept carrying that dripping casket up the path toward where the cemetery used to be. I should have run. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around and get back to my truck. But instead, I followed them. I can't explain why. Maybe it was professional curiosity. Maybe it was something deeper. Some part of me that needed to understand what I was witnessing. The procession wound deeper into the forest. The path here was even more overgrown. In some places, it had disappeared entirely. But they walked with certainty. They knew where they were going. They had walked this path before. I stayed about 20 yards back. Far enough that I felt safe. Close enough that I could still see them through the trees. The singing never stopped. The water never stopped dripping from that casket. I watched it pool on the ground, darkening the leaves and moss. I watched it and tried to make sense of what my eyes were telling me. We walked for maybe 30 minutes. The elevation increased. My legs burned. My breath came harder, but the people in the procession never seemed to tire, never paused, never broke their rhythm. Then we reached a clearing, or what had been a clearing once. Now it was just a bare patch of ground where the soil looked different. Lighter, disturbed. This was where the cemetery had been. I knew it with absolute certainty, even though there was no marker. No sign, nothing but empty ground and the memory of what had been lost. The procession gathered in the clearing. The men carrying the casket set it down gently on the ground. The water continued to seep from it, pooling around the base. The singing stopped. Silence fell over the clearing like a weight. Then they began to dig. With their bare hands, all of them. Men, women, even children I hadn't noticed before. They clawed at the earth, scooping up handfuls of soil, creating a grave. And the strangest part was that the earth moved easily for them. Like it remembered, like it wanted to open up and receive what it had lost. I watched from the tree line. My heart hammered so hard I thought it might burst. My hands were numb. My face felt frozen. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. I was trapped by what I was seeing, by the impossibility of it, by the absolute reality of it. They lowered the casket into the ground. The same 6 men who had carried it. They used ropes, lowered it slowly, carefully, with love, with grief that felt fresh even though a century had passed. When it reached the bottom, more water gushed out, filled the grave, turned the soil to mud. Then they filled it in, hands moving in unison, replacing the earth, covering the casket, creating a mound. And as they worked, they began to fade. Not all at once, gradually, like morning mist burning off in sunlight. First the people at the edges, then those closer to the grave, then finally the 6 men who had carried the casket. Within 5 minutes, they were gone. All of them. The clearing was empty, silent. Only the disturbed earth remained. And the water, a pool of it sitting on top of the fresh grave. Cold water that reflected the gray sky like a mirror. I don't know how long I stood there. Long enough that my legs went stiff. Long enough that the light began to change. Finally, I walked into the clearing. My feet felt like they belonged to someone else. I approached the grave, looked down at that pool of water. My reflection stared back at me. But there was something else in the water. Other faces, dozens of them, looking up at me from beneath the surface. Men, women, children, all of them with the same expression. Not anger, not horror, just sadness. Deep, bottomless sadness. The sadness of being forgotten. Of having your resting place torn away. Of wandering for a century trying to find your way home. I took a step back. The faces remained, watching me, waiting for something. But I didn't. Do you know what? I didn't. You know what they wanted from me? I didn't. Do you know what I could give them? The temperature dropped. My breath came out in visible clouds. The shadows between the trees grew longer, darker. I realized with a spike of panic that I had maybe an hour of daylight left. Maybe less, and I was miles from my truck. Miles from anyone who could help me if something went wrong. I ran. No dignity in it. No measured retreat, just blind panic. I crashed through the underbrush, following my GPS back toward the main trail. Branches tore at my clothes. Roots tried to trip me. The forest seemed to have grown darker, denser, like it was trying to keep me there. Like it wanted me to join those faces in the water. I made it back to my truck just as full darkness fell. My hands shook so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. I drove back to the ranger station too fast, taking the curves too hard, not caring. I just needed to be around other people. Living people. People who cast shadows and left footprints and didn't drip water that smelled like flooded graves. Bill was still there, working late. He took one look at my face and poured me a cup of coffee without asking. I told him what I'd seen. Every detail, expecting him to laugh, expecting him to tell me I was crazy or overtired or that I'd seen some kind of historical reenactment that nobody had bothered to mention. But he didn't. He just nodded slowly, took a sip of his own coffee, and then he told me about the others. The hikers who reported similar things over the years. The maintenance workers who refused to go into certain areas after dark. The researcher who captured audio of the hymn singing and quit her job rather than investigate further. The flood happened in October of 1923, 102 years ago. The storm hit at night. By morning, the entire cemetery was gone, washed down the mountain in a torrent of mud and debris. They found pieces, a headstone here, a piece of casket there, but most of it was just gone, scattered across miles of wilderness. Lost forever. The families wanted to give their dead a proper burial, wanted to gather what remained and create a new cemetery. But there wasn't enough left to bury, so they held a funeral anyway, marched up to where the cemetery had been, sang their hymns, said their prayers, tried to give closure to the dead and to themselves. And, according to Bill, they never stopped. Once a year, always in October, always on the anniversary of the flood, the procession appears, walks the old path, carries a casket that drips water from graves that were disturbed a century ago. They march to the place that no longer exists and bury their dead in earth that can never hold them. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. I couldn't stop thinking about those faces in the water, about the sadness in them, about what it meant to be so thoroughly displaced that even death couldn't give you rest. I went back 3 days later, daylight, armed with every piece of equipment I had. Cameras, audio recorders, soil testing gear. I needed to prove to myself that what I'd seen was real, that I wasn't losing my mind, that grief and isolation hadn't finally broken something essential in my brain. I found the clearing again. It wasn't hard. My GPS had the coordinates. But when I got there, the grave was gone. No disturbed earth, no pool of water, just undisturbed forest floor covered in leaves and moss like nothing had ever happened there. I searched for hours, took soil samples, photographed everything. My equipment registered nothing unusual. The ground was stable, no signs of recent digging, no moisture content that would suggest water had pooled there. Nothing, but I knew what I'd seen. I knew it with the same certainty I knew my own name. Those people had been real. That casket had been real. The water had been real. I finished my survey work 2 weeks later, submitted my maps and reports and recommendations. Professional, complete. I didn't to mention the procession, didn't to mention the phantom funeral. I knew how that would sound. I knew what they would think, but I also couldn't to stop researching. I spent my evenings in libraries, online archives, historical societies. I found records of the flood, newspaper articles, death certificates. I found a list of the people buried in that cemetery. 28 names. Men, women, children, farmers, craftsmen, a schoolteacher, a minister, regular people who lived hard lives in those mountains and expected nothing more than to rest peacefully when those lives were done. I found something else too. A journal entry from one of the survivors, a woman named Martha Collins. She described the funeral procession they held after the flood. Described how they walked up the mountain carrying an empty casket. How they dug a symbolic grave. How the whole time, water kept seeping up from the ground. Cold water, like the mountain itself was weeping. Like the earth was trying to get back what the flood had taken. She wrote that as they were leaving, she looked back and saw the casket they buried was dripping. Water running down the sides. Pooling in the grave. She thought she was seeing things. grief playing tricks on her mind. But others saw it too. They all saw it, and they knew, somehow, that their dead would never rest. That the flood had disturbed something that couldn't be repaired. That some wounds cut too deep for time to heal. I think about that a lot now, about how trauma echoes, how violence against the dead leaves scars that never fade, how the need for rest, for closure, for being properly mourned, might be strong enough to punch through the barrier between worlds and manifest year after year after year. I haven't been back to Cades Cove. I submitted a request to be reassigned to different territories. My supervisor approved it without question. Maybe Bill said something to him. Maybe I am not the first person to ask for reassignment after working that area. But I dream about it, about that clearing, about those faces in the water, about the hymns they sang. And sometimes, on October nights when the weather turns and rain falls hard against my windows, I hear singing. Faint, distant, old-time hymns rising from somewhere deep in memory or imagination or whatever thin place exists between the living and the dead. I tell myself it's just my mind playing tricks, just stress, just lingering trauma from seeing something I couldn't explain. But I know better. I know what I heard in those mountains. I know what I saw. Some debts can never be repaid. Some wounds can never heal. And some people, even in death, will keep walking that path. Keep singing those songs. Keep trying to find their way home to a place that no longer exists. Year after year, October after October, until the mountains themselves crumble to dust and even memory fades. I just hope I'm never there to see it again. Story 7. Watchers of Newman, S. Ridge. I need to tell you about the 3 days I lost on Newman, S. Ridge in Tennessee. Not lost in the sense that I couldn't find my way. Lost in the sense that I can to account for them. Can to remember them. Can to explain what happened to my truck, my camera equipment, or why I woke up in a motel room 70 miles away with someone else, with blood under my fingernails. I am a freelance journalist. I chase stories that mainstream media won't touch. Cryptids, hauntings, conspiracy theories, the weird corners of America where reality gets slippery. It pays the bills, barely, but it keeps me moving. Keeps me from thinking too much about the life I left behind in Chicago after my partner died. After I couldn't to save her, the story that brought me to Newman, S. Ridge was about the Melungeons. Mixed-race people who settled in Appalachia centuries ago. Their origins are still debated. Some say they were descendants of shipwrecked Portuguese sailors. Others claim Turkish or North African ancestry. The mystery alone made them interesting. But what really caught my attention was the other thing people whispered about. The Watchers. According to local legend, there are figures that appear near the old Appalachian Cemetery on Newman, S. Ridge. Tall, pale, luminous skin that seems to glow faintly in darkness. They stand at the tree line and watch. Never approach, never interact, just watch. And when they present, technology fails. Cars start. Cameras malfunction. Cell phones die. Like they exist in a pocket of reality where modern tools have no power. I heard variations of this story for years. Usually dismissed it as typical Appalachian folklore. But then I found 3 separate police reports from the last 18 months. All describing stranded motorists near the cemetery. All mentioning seeing tall figures watching from the trees. All reporting complete electrical failure in their vehicles that mechanics couldn't explain later. That was enough. I packed my gear and drove down from Louisville where I'd been covering a different story. The drive took 6 hours. I arrived at Newman, S. Ridge just before sunset on a Friday in late September. The ridge itself is remote. The kind of place where paved roads give way to gravel and then to dirt. Where houses thin out until you surrounded by nothing but forest and mountain. The cemetery sat on a plateau near the top. Small, maybe 30 headstones. Some so old the names had worn away. A rusted iron fence surrounded it. The gate hung crooked on broken hinges. I parked my truck on the shoulder of the narrow road and grabbed my camera. Professional grade. Expensive. I maxed out 2 credit cards to buy it. The light was perfect. Golden hour. Long shadows. The kind of atmospheric shots that subscribers love. I started filming, establishing shots of the cemetery. Close-ups of the weathered headstones. The usual content. That is when I felt it. The sensation of being watched. Not the paranoid feeling you get alone in the woods. This was different. Specific. Directional. Like someone was standing behind me and staring at the back of my head. I turned around. The tree line was about 50 yards away. Dense forest. Oak and hickory and pine. and standing between the trees were 3 figures. Tall, at least 7 feet, maybe more, hard to judge distance. Their skin had an odd quality. Pale, almost white, but not like human pale, more like the color of mushrooms that grow in caves. In the failing light, they seemed to emit their own faint glow. They weren't moving, just standing there, watching me. My journalist instincts kicked in. I raised my camera, pointed it at them, looked through the viewfinder, but the screen showed nothing. Static, digital noise, like the camera couldn't process what it was seeing. I lowered it, checked the settings. Everything looked normal. Raised it again, same result, just static where the figures should be. I tried my phone, pulled it from my pocket to take a photo. The screen was black, dead, but I decharged it fully before leaving the truck. It had been at 98%. When I looked back at the tree line, there were 5 figures now, spread out, equally spaced, all watching, all completely still. My heart started hammering. This was real. This was actually happening. The stories were true. I was looking at something that shouldn't exist, something that broke the rules. I backed toward my truck, slowly, keeping my eyes on the figures. They didn't follow, didn't move at all, just watched. I reached my truck, opened the door, slid behind the wheel, put the key in the ignition. Nothing. The engine didn't turn over, didn't even click. Complete electrical death. I tried again, and again. Nothing. The dashboard was dark. No lights, no power. The truck was only 3 years old. Battery was new. There was no mechanical reason for this. I looked toward the cemetery. 7 figures now. They moved closer. Not walking. I hadn't seen them move. They were just closer, maybe 30 yards away, standing in a line between me and the road leading down the ridge. The temperature dropped. My breath came out in clouds. It had been 60 degrees when I arrived. Now it felt like it was below freezing. I could see frost forming on the inside of my windshield. I made a decision, grabbed my backpack, got out of the truck, started walking the other direction, away from the figures, deeper into the ridge. There had to be another way down. Another road, a house, something. The forest swallowed me quickly. The light was almost gone now, that brief window between sunset and full dark. I moved fast. Branches scraped my face. Roots tried to trip me. Behind me, I heard nothing. No footsteps, no rustling, just silence, absolute silence. No insects, no birds, no wind. I stopped, listened. The silence was wrong. Forests are never silent. There's always something moving, something alive. But here, there was nothing, like sound itself had been erased. Then I saw them again, to my left. 4 figures standing between trees, watching. I turned right, ran. My lungs burned. My legs ached. I crashed through underbrush, not caring about the noise, just trying to put distance between myself and them. I ran for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Finally, I stopped, bent over, gasping. My chest felt like it was full of broken glass. I looked around, couldn't see the figures anymore, couldn't see anything familiar. The forest was dark now, full dark, and I had no light. My phone was dead. My flashlight was in the truck. I kept walking, slower now, using my hands to feel my way between trees. The temperature was still freezing. My fingers were numb. My face felt like stone. Then I saw light ahead. Faint, flickering, orange light like fire or lanterns. I moved toward it, careful, quiet. The light came from a clearing. And in the clearing was a house. Old, 2 stories, wood siding painted white but peeling badly. Windows glowing with that orange light. Smoke rising from a chimney. I approached the house. Every rational part of my brain screamed that this was wrong. That abandoned houses don't have fires in their fireplaces. That light means people and people mean questions I couldn't answer. But I was freezing, lost. My truck was dead and my equipment was fried. I needed help. I climbed the porch steps. They creaked under my weight. The door was old wood. Heavy. I knocked. The sound echoed. Inside, I heard movement. Footsteps. The door opened. An old woman stood there. Small, thin, white hair pulled back in a bun. Eyes that were too pale, almost colorless. Her skin had that same quality I'd seen on the figures. That mushroom white pallor, that faint luminescence. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she stepped aside, gestured for me to enter. I hesitated. Every instinct said to run. But where would I go? Back into the freezing forest? Back toward the figures that had herded me here? I went inside. The interior was warm. A fire burned in a stone fireplace. The furniture was old, handmade, the kind of stuff you see in historical museums. Oil lamps provided the light. No electricity, no modern anything. The woman pointed to a chair near the fire. I sat. She disappeared into another room. Came back with a blanket. Handed it to me. I wrapped it around my shoulders. The warmth felt incredible. I could feel my fingers again. Could think again. She sat across from me. Watching. Not hostile. Just observing. Like I was something curious. Something unexpected. I tried to speak. To explain. To ask questions. But she held up a hand. Shook her head. Then she pointed at me. At my eyes. Then pointed at her own eyes. And I understood. She couldn't speak. Or wouldn't. But she could see me. Really see me. In a way that made my skin crawl. She stood. Walked to a shelf. Took down a leather-bound book. Old. The pages were yellow and brittle. She opened it. Showed me. Inside were drawings. Crude but detailed. They showed the cemetery. The ridge. And the figures. Dozens of them. Standing in circles around the graves. Some of the drawings were dated. The oldest was from 1762. She turned more pages. More drawings. More dates. The figures appeared in every image. Always watching. Always present. Guarding something. But what? Then she showed me a drawing that made my blood freeze. It showed a man. Normal height. Normal build. But his skin had that same pale quality. That same luminescence. And around him stood the tall figures. Not threatening. Protecting. Like he was one of them. Or becoming one of them. She looked at me. Tapped the drawing. Then tapped my chest. And I understood what she was saying. What she was warning me about. I stood. Dropped the blanket. Back toward the door. She didn't try to stop me. Just watched with those pale, colorless eyes. I reached the door. Opened it. Stumbled out onto the porch. The clearing was full of them now. Dozens of figures. Standing in the yard. On the road. Between the trees. All watching. All waiting. And in the faint light from the house, I could see they weren't identical. Some were taller. Some broader. Some had features that were almost human. Some that were decidedly not. I ran. Again. Crashing blindly through the forest. Behind me, I heard nothing. They didn't chase. Didn't too. Where could I go? The ridge was their territory. Had been for centuries. I was the intruder. I don't remember much after that. Fragments. Images. I remember falling. Remember crawling. Remember lying on cold ground and looking up at stars that seemed wrong somehow. Too close. Too bright. Like the sky itself was watching me. I remember hands. Cold hands. Lifting me. Carrying me. I remember that pale skin pressed against mine. Remember feeling my own skin growing cold. Growing numb. Remember thinking this is how it happens. This is how people disappear. This is how you become one of them. Then nothing. Black. Empty. Gone. I woke up 3 days later in a motel room in Kingsport, Tennessee. 70 miles from Newman, this ridge. The room was registered in my name. Paid in cash. But I don't remember driving there. Don't remember checking in. Don't remember those 3 days at all. My truck was in the motel parking lot. Keys on the nightstand. It started fine. No electrical problems. Like nothing had ever been wrong. My camera was in the back seat. But when I checked it, every file was corrupted. Just digital noise. Static. My phone worked. But the last entry in my GPS history was the cemetery on Newman, this ridge. Nothing after that. And there was blood under my fingernails. Not mine. I checked. No cuts. No injuries. Someone else's blood. But whose? And why? What happened during those 3 days? I drove back to Newman, this ridge 2 weeks later. Daylight. Armed. Cameras. Recording equipment. Determination to document what I seen. To prove it. To make sense of it. But I couldn't find the cemetery. I drove that road 3 times. Stopped at every turnoff. Every shoulder. The cemetery was gone. Not destroyed. Just gone. Like it had never existed. The forest was different too. The trees were wrong. The road was wrong. Everything was slightly off. I asked locals about Newman, this ridge. About the cemetery. About the Melungeons. Most people looked at me like I was crazy. A few got nervous. Changed the subject. One old man at a gas station pulled me aside. Told me to leave it alone. Told me that some people who go looking for the watchers don't to come back the same. And some don't come back at all. They've been researching since then. They've found historical records of the Melungeon settlement. Found mentions of the cemetery. Found old maps that show it exactly where I remember. But when I go there, it's just forest. Empty forest. I've also been noticing changes. Small ones. My skin is paler. Not much, but enough that people comment. Enough that I notice in mirrors. My eyes look different. Lighter. Like the colors washing out. And sometimes, late at night, I see things in the dark. Shapes. Figures. standing at the edges of rooms, watching from corners. Don, do you know what happened to me on Newman, Miss Ridge? Don, do you know what I did during those 3 days? Don, do you know whose blood was under my nails or why I can? Do you remember? But I know this, the watchers are real. They've been there for centuries, guarding something, protecting something. And whatever that something is, it is connected to the Melungeons, to that cemetery, to people who don't quite fit, people who exist in the spaces between. And I think I am becoming one of them. I think whatever they did to me during those 3 days started a process, a transformation. I can feel it in my bones, in my blood. I am getting colder. My thoughts are getting slower, more patient, less human. Sometimes I dream about the ridge, about standing in the cemetery, about watching the road, about being patient, about waiting for what? Do you know? But I'll know when it arrives. We all will. And the terrifying part? I am starting to be okay with it. Story 8. Witch. This bargain every morning for the last 8 months. I wake up to find a single gray hair on my pillow. Not mine. I am 37 and still have a full head of brown hair. This hair is different, longer, coarser, ancient somehow, and it is always in the exact same spot, right where my head rests, like someone placed it there while I was sleeping. I know where it comes from. I know what I did, and I need to tell someone before it gets worse, before the wish I made finishes twisting into something I can decontrol. My name is Derek. I am a software engineer from Pittsburgh. Normal life, normal job, or at least it was normal until my daughter got sick. Leukemia, acute lymphoblastic, the aggressive kind. She was 6 years old. Emma, bright kid, loved dinosaurs and space and asking questions I couldn't answer. The doctors gave her a 30% chance, maybe less. I did everything right. Best hospitals, best doctors, second opinions, third opinions, experimental treatments. I spent every dollar I had and then borrowed more. Maxed out credit cards, took loans against my house. My wife Sarah and I took turns sleeping in Emma's hospital room, watching her get weaker, watching her smile fade, watching her stop asking questions because she didn't have the energy anymore. The treatments weren't working. After 6 months, the doctors pulled us aside. Their faces told us everything before they spoke. We were looking at weeks, maybe a month. They were sorry. They'd done everything they could. We should make Emma comfortable. Spend time with her? Say goodbye? I couldn't accept that. Wouldn't. There had to be something. Some option we hadn't tried. Some miracle we hadn't found yet. I started looking in places rational people done to look. Alternative medicine, faith healers, anything that promised hope. That is how I found the story about Helvetia Cemetery in West Virginia. I was deep in some conspiracy forum at 3 a.m. Couldn't sleep. Emma had been crying earlier and nothing I did helped. The morphine wasn't enough anymore. I was desperate, scrolling through threads about miracle cures and divine intervention. Most of it was garbage, scams, snake oil, but one post caught my attention. It was about a cemetery in a small Swiss heritage town in West Virginia, a place called Helvetia. According to the post, there was a witch buried there, back in the 1800s. The townspeople accused her of dark magic, murdered her, buried her in unconsecrated ground at the edge of the cemetery, and the legend said she still granted wishes. 1 wish per person. You had to visit her grave at midnight. Leave a lock of your hair. Make your wish, and she would grant it. But there was a warning. The wish always came true, but it was always twisted. Never exactly what you wanted. Always corrupted somehow. And if you made the bargain, you find one of her gray hairs on your pillow every morning for the rest of your life. A reminder, a mark, proof that you dealt with something you shouldn't have touched. Rational me knew it was nonsense, superstition, folklore, but desperate me didn't care. What did I have to lose? A 6-hour drive to West Virginia? A lock of my hair? If there was even a 1% chance it could save Emma, I had to try. I didn't tell Sarah. She would try to stop me. They said I was losing it. That grief was making me crazy. Maybe she would have been right. But I went anyway. I left on a Thursday night. Told Sarah I needed to drive around. Clear my head. She understood. She see me falling apart. Watched me stop sleeping. Stop eating. Stop being present. She kissed my forehead and told me to be safe. I promised I would be. I lied. The drive took 6 hours. I arrived in Helvetia just after 2 a.m. The town was tiny, maybe 100 people. Swiss-style buildings. Old world architecture. It felt like I'd driven into the past. Everything was dark. No streetlights. No gas stations. Just a handful of old houses and a church with a white steeple visible against the night sky. The cemetery was behind the church. Small, maybe 50 graves. Most of the headstones were old, weathered, names in German, dates from the 1800s. I parked on the dirt road and grabbed my flashlight. The air was cold. October in the mountains. My breath came out in clouds. I found the witch, this grave exactly where the forum post said it would be. Far corner, away from the other graves. The headstone was simple, just a name, Elsbeth Richter, and dates, born 1798, died 1843, 45 years old, younger than I expected. The stone was covered in moss, weathered almost smooth, but I could still read the name. I stood there for a long time, feeling ridiculous, feeling desperate, feeling like I was losing my mind. But I'd come this far. I pulled out the scissors I brought, cut a lock of my hair. It felt stupid, childish, like making a wish on a birthday candle. But I did it anyway. I placed the hair on the grave, closed my eyes, and I made my wish. I wished for Emma to live, to be healthy, to have a full life. That's all. Nothing complicated, nothing selfish, just my daughter. This life. The wind stopped, completely. The forest went silent. No insects, no rustling leaves, nothing, just dead quiet, and the temperature dropped, fast, like standing in front of an open freezer. I could see my breath, could feel ice forming on my eyelashes. Then I felt something, a hand on my shoulder. Cold, impossibly cold, like touching dry ice. I spun around. Nobody there. Just darkness, empty cemetery. But the feeling remained. That pressure on my shoulder. That cold seeping through my jacket, through my shirt, into my skin. I ran, back to my car, hands shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. I drove away fast, too fast for those narrow mountain roads. Didn't care, just needed distance between me and that place. That grave, that feeling. I made it back to Pittsburgh by 9 in the morning. Went straight to the hospital. Sarah was in Emma's room. She looked exhausted, hadn't slept, but when she saw me, she grabbed my arm. Her eyes were wide, confused, hopeful. The doctors had run tests that morning. Routine blood work, but the results didn't make sense. Emma's white blood cell count had normalized. The cancer markers had dropped. Dramatically, impossibly. They were running more tests, checking for lab errors, but the initial results showed remission. Complete remission. I should have been happy. Should have been crying with relief. But all I felt was cold. That same cold from the cemetery. Like it had followed me home. Like it was inside me now. Emma recovered. Fast. Faster than any of the doctors expected. Within 2 weeks, she was out of the hospital. Within a month, she was back in school. The cancer was gone. Completely. The doctors called it a miracle. A spontaneous remission. 1 in a million. They wrote papers about it. Used her case in medical journals. They had no explanation. Just statistics. Just luck. But I knew what I'd done. And I waited for the twist. For the corruption. For whatever price Elsbeth Richter was going to extract. The gray hair appeared a week after Emma came home. I woke up, looked at my pillow, and there it was. One long gray hair. Not mine, not Sarah. It was just lying there, like someone had placed it deliberately. I threw it away. Didn't think much of it. Figured it came from somewhere else. The laundry, a friend, this house, anywhere but a dead witch, this grave. But the next morning, it was back. Same spot, same length, same coarse texture. I threw it away again. And again it returned, every single morning, for 8 months now. Always there, always the same. A reminder of what I'd done. A mark of the bargain I'd made. But that is not the worst part. The hair is just the reminder. The real twist is what happened to Emma. She's alive, healthy, cancer-free, exactly what I wished for. But she is different now, changed, in ways that grow more obvious every day. She doesn't sleep anymore. Not really. I would check on her at night. 2 in the morning, 3, 4. She is always awake, sitting up in bed, staring at nothing, eyes open. But when I ask her about it the next day, she insists she slept fine. Had good dreams. Doesn't remember being awake. She knows things she shouldn't. Last week, she told me my boss was going to get fired. I laughed it off, but 3 days later, he was gone. Corporate restructuring. No warning. Emma just smiled when I told her. Said she'd seen it. I asked what she meant. She said sometimes she sees things that haven't happened yet. Like watching a movie that hasn't been released. Her eyes are different too. Darker. Not the color, the expression. Like she is looking at you from very far away. Like she is seeing through you instead of at you. Sarah notices it too, but doesn't say anything. Doesn't want to acknowledge it. Doesn't want to admit that our miracle might have come with a cost. And Emma talks about Elsbeth, casually, like they were friends. She mentions her at dinner, says Elsbeth told her things, taught her things. I ask who Elsbeth is. Emma just smiles, says I know who she is, says I brought them together. 2 months ago, Emma started drawing. She had never been particularly artistic before, but now she fills notebooks with sketches. Detailed, disturbing. She draws a woman in old-fashioned clothes, long dress, bonnet, severe face, and in every drawing, the woman is standing in a cemetery. Always the same cemetery, always the same grave. Elsbeth Richter, this grave. I asked Emma where she learned to draw like that. She said Elsbeth taught her, said Elsbeth visits her, teaches her things, old things, secret things, things about the world that most people don't see. I told Sarah we needed to talk, needed to address what was happening. She refused, said Emma was fine, said I was imagining things, said grief and stress had messed with my head. But I see the fear in her eyes. She knows something is wrong. She just can't admit it, can face what it means. Last week, I drove back to Helvetia, back to that cemetery. I needed to understand what I'd done, needed to know if there was a way to undo it, to break the bargain, to give back the wish and get my real daughter back. I found the grave, same spot, same weathered headstone, but something was different. There were fresh flowers on it, wildflowers, recently placed, and written in the dirt beside the grave was a message. Simple, clear, unmistakable. Thank you. My blood went cold. Emma, she'd been here. Somehow, I don't know how. We live 6 hours away. She is 7 years old. But she'd been here. Left flowers, left a message, for the witch who saved her life. The witch who now lived inside her, or beside her, or through her. I don't understand the mechanics. Don, to understand the rules. But I understand the result. I didn't wish for Emma to live. Not really. I wished for a healthy child. And this is what I got. But the child I have now isn't quite Emma anymore. She is something else. Something that wears Emma's face, uses Emma's voice, but looks at me with eyes that have seen centuries. That no things no 7-year-old should know. The wish was granted, exactly as spoken, but twisted, always twisted. Emma is alive. Emma is healthy. Emma will probably live a very long life. But the cost was Emma herself, her innocence, her humanity, the things that made her my daughter. And every morning, I wake up to that gray hair, that reminder, that mark, proof that I made a deal with something I didn't understand. Something ancient, something patient, something that has been waiting in that cemetery for 180 years for desperate fools like me. Sarah still doesn't see it, doesn't want to see it. She has her daughter back. That is all that matters to her. The cancer is gone. Emma is alive. That is the miracle she prayed for. She is not going to question it, not going to look deeper, not going to acknowledge the wrongness. But I see it every day. I watch this thing that looks like Emma, sounds like Emma, pretends to be Emma. I watch it learn, grow, become more confident, more powerful. And I wonder what Elsbeth Richter's endgame is. Why she granted my wish, what she wants from Emma, or what Emma is becoming. Sometimes I think about going back to that cemetery, about digging up that grave, about doing whatever it takes to break this. But I know it won to work. You can undo a bargain once it is made. You can take back a wish once it is granted. You can only live with the consequences. Live with the knowledge that you traded something precious for something you thought you wanted. Emma asked me yesterday if I was happy, if I was glad she was alive. I told her yes, of course. What else could I say? She smiled. That strange, knowing smile. And she told me not to worry. Said Elsbeth promised it would all make sense eventually. Said I made the right choice. Said I saved her life. But she was wrong. I didn't save Emma's life. I traded it for something that looks like life, something that mimics life, something that will go on living long after I'm gone. Long after Sarah is gone. Maybe forever. And every morning, I'll wake up to that gray hair on my pillow. That reminder of my choice. That mark of my desperation. That proof that sometimes the cure is worse than the disease. And sometimes, getting exactly what you wished for is the most terrifying thing that can happen. Story 9. Black Diamond Miner. This last shift I saw him for the first time at 5 in the morning, walking through the cemetery gates with a dented lunch pail swinging from his left hand. He wore clothes that belonged to another century. Coal dust covered every inch of him, and he was see-through, not like fog or mist, see-through like a projection, like something burned into the air itself. That was 3 weeks ago. I should have left Harwick, Pennsylvania that same day. My name is David Brennan, and I came to this dying mining town to document abandoned industrial sites for a photography project. Ghost towns have always fascinated me. The way places echo with the lives that once filled them. How silence can scream if you listen hard enough. Harwick seemed perfect. A former coal mining hub. Population down to maybe 300 people. Most of them were 60. The kind of place young people flee from and never look back. I rented a room above the only bar still operating on Main Street. The owner, a weathered woman named Carol, barely spoke when she handed me the key. She did mention one thing though. Stay away from Fraterville Cemetery after dark. When I asked why, she just shook her head and walked away. That was my first warning. I ignored it, of course. Photographers like me, we chase the things normal people avoid. The unsettling, the forgotten. I set up my camera equipment that first evening and walked the 2 miles to the cemetery on the edge of town. The place sat on a hill overlooking what remained of the old mine entrance, now sealed with concrete and rusted chain-link fence. Headstones stretched across the slope in uneven rows, many dating back to the early 1900s. The inscriptions told stories of sudden death, entire families wiped out in single years, men who died at 25, 30, 32. Mining accidents, black lung, cave-ins. This ground held more tragedy per square foot than any place I had ever documented. I took photos until the light failed. The shots came out beautifully haunting. Crumbling angels, names worn smooth by a century of rain. The silhouette of the old mine head frame against the sunset. I felt that familiar rush, knowing I had captured something powerful. Something that would resonate with viewers. Then I heard the footsteps. Slow, deliberate. The crunch of boots on gravel. I turned, expecting a groundskeeper or maybe another visitor paying respects. The cemetery was empty. The sound continued, closer now, moving between the headstones to my left. I called out. No response. Just those steady footsteps circling around me, always just out of sight behind the next row of graves. My rational mind tried to explain it away. Old cemeteries settle. Wind plays tricks. Animals move through underbrush. But I have been in hundreds of abandoned places, and I know the difference between natural sounds and something else. This was something else. I packed my equipment and left, walking fast, not quite running, but close. That night in my rented room, I could not sleep. I kept hearing those footsteps. I kept seeing the spaces between headstones where nothing visible moved, but something definitely was there. Around 2 in the morning, I finally drifted off. My alarm went off at 4:45. I had set it wrong, meaning to wake at 7. Too groggy to fall back asleep, I made coffee and sat by the window overlooking Main Street. The town was dead silent. Not even a dog barking. Just sodium streetlights casting yellow pools on empty pavement. Then I saw him. At exactly 5 o'clock, a figure appeared at the far end of the street. Walking with purpose. Even from 3 stories up, I could see the lunch pail. The old-style work clothes. The cap pulled low. He moved like a man late for something important. That quick mining town stride I had seen in historical photographs. He turned at the corner, heading north toward the cemetery. I grabbed my camera and stumbled downstairs, not bothering with shoes, just socks on cold pavement as I rushed into the street. He was already a block ahead. I ran, my camera banging against my chest. He never looked back, never slowed. At the cemetery gates, he walked straight through without opening them. Through them, not around, through. I stopped, my hands shaking, my breath coming in gasps. I raised my camera and fired off 3 shots before my nerve broke completely. Then I turned and ran back to my room like a child fleeing nightmares. The photos showed nothing. Empty gates, empty street, but I knew what I had seen. I spent that morning in the town library, a cramped building that smelled of mold and old paper. The librarian, a man in his 70s with the persistent cough of someone who breathed too much coal dust in his youth, helped me find the local history section. I asked about the cemetery, about the mine. His expression changed, became guarded. He pulled out a leather-bound book, its spine cracked and pages yellow. The Fraterville mine disaster of 1902. May 19th. An explosion caused by methane gas ignited by a spark from mining equipment. 216 men killed. The worst mining disaster in Tennessee history until Fraterville, Pennsylvania had its own catastrophe 6 months later. Another explosion, 83 dead. I read the names, column after column. Fathers and sons who died together. Brothers who clocked in for the same shift and never clocked out. The town buried them in mass graves, individual plots too expensive for the mining company to afford. Most families got a single headstone with multiple names carved beneath. One name appeared without any family attached. Thomas Reichman, age 31, identified by his lunch pail, which survived the blast intact. His body was found near the main shaft, apparently trying to reach the surface even as the mine collapsed around him. The librarian cleared his throat, said I should leave that book alone, that some things in Harwick should stay buried. When I asked what he meant, he walked away without another word. That night, I returned to the cemetery. I needed to find Thomas Reichman. It was great. I needed to understand what I had seen. The sun was setting as I climbed the hill, long shadows stretching between the headstones like grasping fingers. I found the mass grave section, rows of simple markers, most listing 4 or 5 names. Then I found his stone, smaller than the others, just his name and dates, 1871 to 1902. Below that, an inscription worn almost smooth. I knelt down and ran my fingers over the letters, trying to read them by touch. Something about duty, something about the last shift. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in an instant. My breath came out in clouds. Ice crystals formed on the grass around me. And behind me, I heard the scrape of a boot on stone. I turned slowly. He stood 10 feet away. Thomas Reichman, solid now, not see-through, covered head to toe in coal dust and dried blood. His eyes were empty sockets. His mouth hung open, revealing teeth broken by the blast that killed him. The lunch pail dangled from fingers that ended in torn stumps where the explosion had ripped away his nails. He took a step toward me. I could not move. Terror locked my muscles. My camera hung forgotten around my neck. He raised one ruined hand and pointed past me, toward the sealed mine entrance visible at the bottom of the hill. His jaw moved. No sound came out, but I could read the words on his destroyed lips. Still down there? Then he was gone. Vanished like smoke. The temperature returned to normal. The cemetery was just a cemetery again. But I knew what he meant. I spent the next week researching everything I could find about the Harwick mine disaster. The official reports, the newspaper coverage, the company records. The explosion happened during the night shift. 83 men went down. The company sealed the mine 3 days later, claiming the structure was too unstable for recovery operations. They paid out minimal compensation to families and moved on to more profitable sites. But here's what bothered me. The official count said 83 bodies were recovered and identified, yet the master roster showed 84 men clocked in that night. One name had been crossed out. No notation, no explanation, just a line through the name and no death certificate filed. That name was listed twice, once crossed out on the night shift roster, once on the day shift roster where it should not have been. Thomas Reichman clocked in for the day shift at 5 a.m. on May 20th. But he died in the night shift explosion 12 hours earlier. Someone had manipulated the records, hidden the fact that he was in the mine when it blew. Why? I found my answer in a box of personal letters donated to the library by a descendant of the mine foreman. Correspondence between the mining company executives, dated 2 weeks before the disaster. Thomas Reichman had filed safety complaints, reported gas levels too high, refused to take his crew down. The company needed production numbers up. They fired him, told him his last shift would be night shift. May 19th. A punishment. Everyone knew the night shift was when they pushed hardest, when they ignored safety protocols to meet quotas. He died trying to prove them wrong, trying to get out, trying to survive long enough to tell someone what really happened down there. And for 123 years, he had been walking to that mine every morning at 5 a.m., lunch pail in hand, trying to clock in for a shift that would never come. I understood then. He was not haunting the cemetery. He was trapped in the moment before, the routine that had defined his life. The walk to work, the preparation, the assumption that he would come home at the end of the day. His consciousness was stuck in those last innocent minutes before everything went wrong. I also understood something else. The night I heard footsteps circling me in the cemetery, someone was trying to warn me, to make me leave, because I was getting too close to something the town wanted forgotten. 3 nights ago, I went back to the sealed mine entrance. I had to see it, had to stand where Thomas Reichman stood every morning. The chain-link fence had a gap cut in the bottom, probably by teenagers looking for a thrill. I crawled through. The concrete seal had cracked over the decades. Water damage, freeze-thaw cycles, time doing what time does. Behind the largest crack, I saw darkness. And I heard something, voices, faint, coming from deep underground, calling for help, begging for someone to remember them, to tell their families what happened, to not let the mine company, Its lies become the only truth. 83 bodies recovered. But how many men were actually down there that night? How many names got crossed off rosters? How many families were told their husbands and fathers simply ran off, abandoned them, rather than admit the company sent too many men down a mine they knew was going to blow? I pressed my ear to the crack. The voices grew louder. I recognized one of them. Thomas Reichman, not walking to work this time, screaming from below, trapped forever in the moment of the explosion, experiencing it over and over, never able to escape, never able to warn anyone. And then I heard my own voice mixed in with the others. Screaming, begging, trapped. I pulled back from the crack. My hands were covered in coal dust. How? I had not touched anything. I looked down at my clothes. My jeans and jacket were gone. I wore rough work clothes from another era, heavy boots, a cap, and in my left hand, a dented lunch pail. I tried to drop it. My fingers would not open. I tried to run. My feet carried me up the hill toward the cemetery gates. I tried to scream. My jaw would not move. The sun rose. 5 a.m. exactly. I walked through the cemetery gates, heading toward a mine that had been sealed for over a century. My shift was starting. I was going to be late. The foreman hated when men were late. I had to clock in. Had to get down to the second level. Had to finish my work. I have been walking this route for 3 weeks now. Every morning at 5 a.m. exactly. I cannot stop. Cannot break the pattern. I see people sometimes. A photographer set up equipment in the cemetery yesterday. Took pictures of the headstones. I tried to warn him. Tried to make footsteps loud enough that he would hear. Would leave. Would not make the same mistakes I made. He did not listen. He came back. He went to the mine. He put his ear to the crack. This morning I saw 2 figures walking toward the cemetery gates. Both carrying lunch pails. Both covered in coal dust. Both trapped in routines that led to their deaths. The town wants this buried. The mine company won. They saved money by sealing men underground and hiding records. They turned deaths into disappearances. Tragedies into mysteries. And now Harwick keeps its secrets by adding to them. One person every few decades. Just enough to maintain the pattern. Just enough to feed whatever is down in that mine. I do not know if anyone will hear this. I do not know if I even said it out loud or if it is just another thought circling in my head as I walk this same road for the 10,000th time. But if you are listening, if you are hearing this story, stay away from Harwick, Pennsylvania. Stay away from Fraterville Cemetery. Do not go near the old mine entrance. And if you see a man walking through cemetery gates at 5 in the morning, lunch pail in hand, do not follow him. Because the mine is always hiring, and the shift never ends. Story 10. Weeping Angel of Asheville. The angel was crying black tears when I found it. Not metaphorically, not symbolically. Real liquid streaming down its marble face. Thick, dark, like motor oil or tar. And it smelled wrong, like burning coal mixed with something organic. Something rotting. I am a cemetery restoration specialist. I repair old headstones, clean monuments, preserve historical grave markers. It's solitary work that pays decently and lets me work outdoors. After 15 years as an accountant in Charlotte, I needed something that didn't, to involve fluorescent lights and spreadsheets. Something that let me think, or not think, depending on the day. The job in Asheville came through a historical preservation society. They needed someone to assess and restore monuments in Riverside Cemetery. The place is famous. Thomas Wolfe is buried there. Oh, Henry, Confederate generals. It as a tourist attraction. But it's also old. 1876. The weather and time had taken their toll. Headstones were cracking. Angels were losing fingers. The usual degradation. I arrived on a Monday morning in late October. The leaves were turning. The Blue Ridge Mountains framed the cemetery in shades of gold and rust. Beautiful, peaceful. The kind of place that makes you think about mortality without the horror. Just the quiet acceptance that everything ends. The project manager met me at the gate. Woman in her 60s named Patricia. She'd been working with the cemetery for 30 years. Knew every grave, every story, every legend. She walked me through the grounds, pointing out priority repairs. Cracked marble here, tilting obelisk there. Standard stuff, until we reached the northeast section. That's where I saw the angel. It stood over a grave dated 1892. Marble, life-size, wings spread, face tilted downward with an expression of profound sorrow. The craftsmanship was exceptional. You could see individual feathers in the wings. Strands of hair, the folds in the robe. Whoever carved it had been a master. But what caught my attention were the stains. Black streaks running from the angel, his eyes down its cheeks, down its neck, soaking into the marble. The stone around the streaks had discolored, darkened, like the black substance had been seeping from those eyes for years. Patricia saw me staring. Her expression changed, became guarded. She told me the locals called it the weeping angel, said it cried real tears, black tears, but only after tragedies, fires, accidents, murders. The angel would weep, and within days, something terrible would happen in Asheville. I asked if she believed it. She didn't. She answered directly. Just said the last time the angel wept was 3 days before the warehouse fire on Depot Street. 4 people died. Before that, it wept the week before the school bus accident on I-40. 2 children killed. Before that, the downtown shooting. 3 dead. I told her it was probably just mineral deposits. Water seeping through cracks in the marble, picking up iron or manganese, oxidizing, creating dark stains. Perfectly natural, perfectly explainable. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. Then she told me to inspect it myself, take samples, run tests, see what I found. But she warned me not to touch the tears when they were fresh, not to let them touch my skin, because everyone who had ended up dead within a month. I laughed, told her I to be careful, but inside, I felt something cold settle in my stomach. The way she said it, the certainty in her voice. She believed it completely. I spent the afternoon documenting other repairs, took photos, made notes, measured headstones, professional work, but my mind kept drifting back to that angel, to those black streaks, to Patricia, as warning. I returned to it before leaving. Late afternoon, the cemetery was empty, just me and acres of graves in the mountains watching from above. I approached the angel slowly, studied it up close. The black stains were dry, crusty. I scraped a sample into a vial, took close-up photos, examined the marble for cracks or damage that might explain moisture seepage. Nothing. The marble was solid. No cracks, no fissures, no obvious source for the staining. And when I looked closely at where the tears originated, I saw something that made my skin prickle. The black substance wasn't seeping from cracks in the stone. It was coming from the carved eyes themselves, from the pupils, like the statue was actually producing the tears. I told myself I was seeing things, that the shadows were playing tricks, that there had to be a rational explanation. But as I stood there, I felt it, that sensation of being watched. Not by tourists or groundskeepers, by something else, something that was paying very close attention to me. I left the cemetery as the sun set, drove to my motel, a small place on the outskirts of town, the kind with exterior doors and a parking lot full of pickup trucks. I ordered takeout, sat in my room, looked at the photos I'd taken. The angel stared back at me from my laptop screen. Those empty marble eyes, that expression of grief. I sent the sample to a lab in Raleigh. A friend who owed me a favor, asked him to analyze it, tell me what it was made of. He promised results in a few days. That night, I dreamed about the angel. But in the dream, it wasn't the marble. It was alive, skin instead of stone, eyes that moved and focused on me. And it was crying those black tears. They ran down its face, dripped onto the ground. And where they fell, the earth opened up. Graves split, hands reached up, pulling, grasping, trying to climb out. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart hammering. The digital clock read 3:17. The room was dark except for the light bleeding through the curtains from the parking lot. I lay there, listening, and I heard something, faint, distant, like someone crying, soft, mournful, coming from outside. I got up, looked out the window. The parking lot was empty. Nobody there. But the sound continued. I opened the door, stepped outside. The night air was cold. My breath came out in clouds. The crying was louder now, clearer, and it was coming from the direction of the cemetery. Every rational part of my brain told me to go back inside. Lock the door, ignore it, but I couldn't. I got dressed, got in my truck, drove toward the cemetery. The gates were closed, locked, but I could see over the fence. And in the northeast section, barely visible in the moonlight, I saw movement. Someone standing near the angel. No, not someone, the angel. It was moving, shifting. Its wings were spread wider. Its head was tilted back. And even from the distance, I could see the black tears streaming down its face. I climbed the fence. Do you know why? Curiosity, stupidity, the same impulse that makes you look at a car crash even though you know you shouldn't. I dropped down on the other side, moved through the cemetery, between the headstones, toward the northeast section. The crying grew louder, not human crying, something else, older, deeper, the sound of stone grinding against stone, the sound of earth settling, the sound of something that shouldn't to be able to make sound. I reached the angel. It was still, frozen in its pose, wings spread, face tilted down, but the tears were flowing. Fresh, wet, running down its cheeks in thick streams, pooling at its feet. And the smell, that burning coal smell mixed with rot. It was overwhelming, made my eyes water, made my throat close. I reached out, touched the tears. I don't know why. Patricia had warned me not to. But I needed to know, needed to understand. My fingers came away black, sticky. The substance was warm, body temperature. And when it touched my skin, I felt something. A jolt, like static electricity, like touching a live wire. And then I saw images flashing through my mind, not memories, visions, premonitions, things that hadn't happened yet. A building on fire, people screaming, running, a collapse, bodies buried under rubble, smoke rising into the night sky, and through it all, the sound of that crying, that grinding, that ancient sorrow. I pulled my hand back. The vision stopped, but the black substance remained on my fingers, soaking into my skin, staining it. I tried to wipe it off on my jeans. It didn't come off. Just spread, darkened, like ink, like a brand. I ran back through the cemetery, over the fence, into my truck. I drove back to the motel with shaking hands, went straight to the bathroom, scrubbed my fingers with soap, hot water. Nothing worked. The stain remained, dark, permanent, a mark. The lab results came back 2 days later. My friend called me. His voice was strange, confused. He said the sample was organic, partially, but also mineral, coal dust, ash, and something else, something he couldn't identify, something that didn't match any database. He asked where I got it. I told him not to worry about it, thanked him, hung up. That afternoon, I heard sirens, lots of them, fire trucks, ambulances, police. I turned on the news. A building had collapsed downtown, an old textile mill that had been converted into apartments. Gas leak, explosion, fire. The building came down, trapped people inside. The death toll was still being counted. But it was bad, really bad, and I'd seen it. 2 nights earlier, touching those tears, the angel had shown me, had warned me. But what could I have done? Called the police? Told them a statue showed me the future? They would then laughed, or arrested me. I went back to the cemetery. Had to see it, had to confirm. The angel was dry now. No tears, just those old stains, the black streaks from previous tragedies, previous warnings that nobody heeded. Previous deaths that could have been prevented if anyone had believed. Patricia found me there, standing in front of the angel, staring at my stained fingers. She didn't say anything, just looked at me with sad eyes. Then she told me the history. The angel was placed there in 1892, above the grave of a woman named Eleanor Ashworth. She'd been a medium, a spiritualist, claimed she could see the future, communicate with the dead. The townspeople thought she was a fraud, until she started making predictions. Accurate predictions, a mine collapse, a hotel fire, a flood. She warned people, begged them to listen, but they didn't believe her until it was too late. After the third tragedy she predicted, the town turned on her, accused her of causing the disasters, of being a witch. They burned her house, drove her from town. She died alone in the mountains. Grief and exposure. The only person who mourned her was her brother, a stonemason. He carved the angel himself, made it in her image. Wings spread to protect, face showing the sorrow she carried, the burden of knowing what was coming and being powerless to stop it. And according to legend, Eleanor, as spirit inhabited the statue, continued her work, warning the town, crying before each tragedy, trying to save people even after death. But the town never learned to listen, never learned to believe. And so the tragedies continued, and the angel continued to weep, and people continued to die. Patricia looked at my stained fingers, told me I'd been marked, told me I'd been chosen to carry Eleanor, this burden, that I would see the future now, see the tragedies coming, and I would have the same choice Eleanor had, warn people and be called crazy, or stay silent and live with the guilt. I left Asheville that day, abandoned the restoration project, drove back to Charlotte, tried to forget, tried to pretend it hadn't happened, but the stain on my fingers remained, and the vision started, not constantly, not every day, but randomly, without warning. I did touch something, a doorknob, a steering wheel, someone's hand, and I see car accidents, heart attacks, falls, fires, small tragedies and large ones, personal losses and community disasters, and I feel that same helplessness Eleanor must have felt, knowing what was coming, unable to stop it, unable to make anyone believe. I tried warning people. Once, a coworker, I saw her car accident 3 days before it happened. Told her to take a different road home. She looked at me like I was insane. 3 days later, she was T-boned at an intersection. Broke her back. I visited her in the hospital. She asked how I knew. I couldn't explain. I just left. I don't warn people anymore. What is the point? They won. They believe. They'll just think I'm crazy. Or worse, they'll think I am causing it. Just like the townspeople thought about Eleanor. History repeating. The same fear. The same anger. The same refusal to accept that some people can see what is coming. The stain on my fingers has spread. Up my hand now. Onto my wrist. Like it's growing. Consuming me. Turning me into something else. Something like that angel. Something that watches and knows and grieves but cannot change anything. I haven to been back to Asheville. Haven to see the angel again. But I feel it connected to me. Through the mark. Through the visions. Through the burden we share. And sometimes, late at night, I hear it. That crying. That grinding of stone. That ancient sorrow. And I wonder how many others there are. How many people touch those tears over the years? How many carry this mark? This curse? This gift of terrible knowledge? Are we all connected? All part of Eleanor? This continuing attempt to save a world that refuses to be saved? I don't, But I know this. The angel is still there. Still watching over Asheville. Still crying before each tragedy. Still trying to warn people who want to listen. And somewhere, Eleanor, his spirit continues its work. Spreading the burden. Creating more watchers. More warners. More people cursed with knowledge they can to use. And maybe that is the real horror. Not the tragedies themselves, but the helplessness of seeing them coming, of knowing, of carrying that weight, of being marked by truth that nobody wants to hear. The angel weeps, and now, so do I. The Appalachian cemeteries don't let go easily. Stones crumble, names fade, but the stories stay. Subscribe and ring the bell to keep walking these dark paths with us. Share your location or your own haunted experience below. The night here never fully ends. It just hides, waiting for your return.